So for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to try and, well, I guess I hope it'll be an entertaining and an interesting talk. But let me begin, before I talk about cognitive architectures, by asking the question, well, what is cognition? And the graphic here gives you an indication that different people have different ideas about what's involved in cognition. As part of a network several years ago, we were on a questionnaire and we got 42 responses to the question, what is cognition, and 42 different definitions. At which point, the only thing to do was to invent your own. So this is my definition. So cognition then is a process by which an autonomous system perceives its environment, learns from experience, anticipates the outcome of events, and acts to pursue goals. So action is crucially important in cognition. So don't think action when you think cognition. And then, of course, adapts to changing circumstances. In addition to action, I want to highlight here the importance of the word and the term anticipation. The idea that you engage in prospection, that you're anticipating the outcome of events. So when you think of cognition, I'd like you to think of a sixth sense, a sense that allows you to perceive the future. And so a cognitive system then is continually predicting the need to act, the actions of others, and the outcome of these actions. So always thinking about action. And I tried to capture that here in this little cartoon. So this is where we'd like to be with our cognitive robots today, where we have a robot which is able to assist somebody doing some task here. It's a trivial task of building a puzzle, but it conveys the idea that you have to anticipate what the other person, your collaborator, is doing, and anticipating what they're anticipating as well. So it's a tricky process. So the principal characteristic then of a cognitive agent is the ability to engage in effective action. So action is primary here, but to be able to do that, to pursue goals so that it's useful in a world that's not particularly friendly, it's uncertain. And also bearing in mind that the tasks that you've been given may be underspecified, and that'll become very important later on when I talk about the CRAM cognitive architecture. And the environment is dynamic, it changes. And ideally, we would be able to cooperate with others while we're doing that. So this is what we want in a cognitive agent. So in order to do that, it has to construct models about the way the world works, and then uses those to guide its actions prospectively. That is, it's always anticipating the outcome of any action it takes. And then it updates its models as it learns and interacts with things around it. And a cognitive architecture then, finally, is the way we specify what we need in order to build a system which can do this. So a cognitive architecture is a way of integrating many core cognitive abilities. Perception, attention, paying attention to the things that matter, action selection, so selecting the things that you want to do. You need memory, you need to be able to learn, you need to be able to reason. You need to be able to reason about your reasoning, sometimes called metacognition. So we need to be able to improve our system. And then finally, you need to be able to engage in prospection, that is anticipating the outcome of actions and the future. Now, these core cognitive abilities, these 7 come from a famous survey paper by Yulia Kotsaruba and John Sotzis. They didn't include prospections, but I've added it in because I think it's fundamentally important. So that wasn't part of their survey. So that's what a cognitive architecture does. It dynamically coordinates all of these 8 core cognitive abilities in order to achieve the goals that it's been set. Now, to do that, then you can view it as a software framework. So you have your essential modules, which you've just identified, but it's more than that. You need the relationships between those modules, and even more, you need the algorithmic and representational details. So you have to make a commitment to representations and processes. And some people sometimes misunderstand cognitive architecture, and they view it merely as a nice diagram showing the modules and arrows between them, but it's far deeper than that. Without the commitment to your representations and your processes, it's not a complete architecture. Now, there are 3 different paradigms of cognitive science. There's the cognitivist, there's the emergent, and I'll take you through them briefly from the perspective of cognitive architectures, and then there's hybrid. What I want to point out from the point of view of cognitive architectures, though, is that the term was invented and belongs to the cognitivist branch of cognitive science. It was actually invented by Alan Newell in Carnegie Mellon University. And it dates, and then it's subsequently been used by the other paradigms, and it means something different in the other paradigms. And it goes back to a very famous book that Alan Newell wrote called Unified Theories of Cognition. And this is a book which is amazing in its compass. It tries to cover all the various aspects of cognition from all the different perspectives, psychology, neuroscience, and computer science. And here is a preprint when he was preparing it. This is chapter 3 of the book, and this dates to 1987, and that's the first introduction to the concept of a cognitive architecture. Here it says human, but from the cognitivist perspective, a cognitive architecture applies both to humans and to artificial systems. And so what is that then, according to the cognitivist tradition? It's a hypothesis about those aspects of human cognition which are relatively constant over time and relatively independent of the task. So it's a generic computational model of cognition. It's not task specific. But of course, at some point it has to become task specific and domain specific. And what do you add? You add knowledge. So if you take your cognitive architecture, you add your knowledge, and that's your cognitive model. And that knowledge is typically determined by a designer, either explicitly or implicitly and programmed in. And it's also augmented and adapted using machine learning techniques, much more so now than it was back when in Alan Newell's time. So let me switch over to the other side of the spectrum then and talk about emergent cognitive architecture. So these are focused on development. So initially you have a primitive state with very little cognitive ability, but quite a lot of cognitive capacity. And your job is to develop that capacity so that you are able to behave cognitively in the world over your lifetime. There are different viewpoints on development. There's ones that focus on the individual, that would be Jean Piaget's approach. And there's others that focus on the social development, and that would be, for example, Lev Vygotsky's. So these are two very different theories of cognitive development. They are complementary. So that's very important. You need both. And so then the cognitive architecture becomes what we would refer to as your phylogenetic configuration. So your phylogeny is the state of an infant when they're born, and then they go through a process of ontogenesis or ontogeny. They grow and they develop. So you're born with certain innate skills, and then you have, it's a structure in which we embed these mechanisms. And the one here which is important is motivation. That didn't appear in the core abilities, because if you're going to develop, you have to be motivated to develop. And so we have, as we'll see later on, value systems which drive these. So the development of all of this is what's important in an emergent cognitive architecture. And it's less focused on knowledge and more focused on skills, and in particular, anticipatory adaptive skill construction. What's also key in the emergent cognitive architecture is the physical body. The physical body plays a role in cognition. So the morphology of that body has an important causal role to play in your cognitive model. That's not true in the cognitivist tradition, where the body doesn't really matter. And so therefore the emergent approach rejects this idea of that there's a duality between mind and body, and it sees it as a single system. And it rejects the idea of functionalism, where any useful embodiment, as long as it supports the operations that you need, the symbolic operations typically, then anybody will do. That's not true in the emergent side. The body has a particular role to play, and different bodies bring different facets to the cognitive model. So there are many differences between the two traditions. It's not just a simple idea of one is symbolic and the other is not symbolic. Here are 14 that we've identified in a book. A colleague of mine, Luciana Fadiga and Klaas van Hosten. And here I've just said, I'm not going to walk you through them. If you want to, you can read the article. But the key thing here is that they are very antagonistic, that they take a completely different view on what cognition is and how cognition is achieved. And this brings me to the third paradigm, which is the hybrid systems. And this is where the world is going. People are saying, we would like the best of both worlds, please. And so most of the cognitive architectures that we'll see are actually qualified as hybrid systems. But here I want to distinguish between what Tom Zemke pointed out to me one time when I used to work in Sweden, the difference between little h hybrid and big H hybrid. Big H hybrid would be a hybrid which tried to rationalize and reconcile all of these different antagonistic viewpoints on cognition. And little h says, no, 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 okay, little h hybrid says, I'm just going to have a system which has got symbolic and sub-symbolic representations and symbolic and sub-symbolic reasoning. So most of the hybrid systems I'll talk about fulfill that requirement, but not necessarily the big H requirement. Yeah, Ron Sun, who is one of the most important people in the field of cognitive architectures, introduced a very important paper in 2004, Desiderata, the desirable features of a cognitive architecture. I won't walk through them. I'll just remark that there are cognitive characteristics and behavioral characteristics, and they have to reflect the reality of human and natural cognition. He has a later paper where he identified even more of them, and the importance of learning is key, and the interconnectivity between these processes. And then some other people got in on the act as well. Let's talk about developmental cognitive architectures. And here are 10 which are important. And if you look at number 10, it talks about autonomy. So autonomy becomes important if you want a developmental system, not necessarily required for a hybrid or a cognitivist approach. So that's a key thing. So and then we have Jeff Kritchmar, who's made a major contribution to the area of developmental cognitive architectures as well. And we'll hear more from Jeff later on in my talk. Here he's talking about brain-based devices, and he's interested in building architectures which are inspired by the structure and the function of the human brain. So to summarize then, this just initial overview of cognitive architectures in general, and I'm going to drill down in a moment and show you some specific ones. So we've effectively, all cognitive architectures have to commit to algorithmic formalisms and representational formalisms and show you how the different modules are connected. On the cognitivist or symbolic side, we're focused more on knowledge. On the emergent and on the side, we're more concerned with development and skills rather than knowledge. And then hybrid try to get the best of both worlds. There are many, many surveys of cognitive architectures. The one that I'm going to show you snapshots as I go through my talk is one that I wrote with Klaas and Luciano a few years ago. But the one I really recommend that you read if you want to drill down is read Julia Katsaruba's and John Tsatsis's landmark survey of 84 cognitive architectures. And I'll make reference to that as I go through the talk. By the way, I should point out that Julia Katsaruba and John Tsatsis refer to these as symbolic cognitive architecture. So here's the architectures they survey, nicely drawn, and it's symbolic over on the right-hand side rather than cognitivist, but it means the same thing. So this slide indicates how long these individual cognitive architectures have been worked on, and most of them are still being worked on. So takeaway message from this is cognitive architectures is not an undertaking to be taken lightly. It requires an awful lot of work by an awful lot of people to complete the project. So I'm going to sample a few of them for you. I'm going to start with SOAR because it's the most famous of all. And you've already heard about SOAR. You had SOAR from John Laird yesterday, integrating perception and action. So John, I hope you'll forgive me if you're watching, if I do a disservice to SOAR, but this is my summary from the review I mentioned. But if you really want to know about SOAR, read the book. So this is John's book on the SOAR cognitive architecture, and it all goes back to 1983 when John was a PhD student with Paul Rosenblum in CMU, and is now the torch carrier for SOAR. So it's been and is still being developed. It was Alan Newell's candidate unified theory of cognition, his hypothesis of a unified theory of cognition. It's a production system, which means basically it's rule-based. It operates in different cycles, so you fire your rules. That changes the state of the system. And the idea here is that you're trying to change the state of the system so you achieve a goal. So you have an initial state and you're trying to achieve a goal state, and you're bringing to bear your knowledge of the world on that. So as you go from state to state to state. So that's the key underpinning model of SOAR as it originally was. So knowledge is primary in SOAR, and different types of knowledge. Knowledge about the world, about ideas, about action, knowledge about how to use your knowledge, and knowledge about physical actions. This was one of the early diagrams of SOAR, and it's changed enormously over the years. This is a more recent one. And it's instructive to look at this evolution of SOAR over the years. So this goes back to 2012. We've got semantic memory, memory about facts about the world, episodic memory about your experiences in the world, procedural memory. It's important here that procedural memory in SOAR is slightly different to other architectures. It's the rules that drive the behavior of the cognitive system. You can learn with all of these. Chunking is a term that's used in SOAR to refer to learning new rules. And we've got reinforcement learning. We've got working memory, which is where you're handling your current goal. You've got short-term memory, which is your current perceptions. You've got a visual memory, which is long-term. That's a very important part of the new SOAR. And of course, we've got mental imageries where you can rehearse the carrying out of actions. You can perceive, and then you can act in the world. But you heard about that yesterday. Now, I've probably done a great disservice to John and to SOAR in that very, very quick overview. So you'll be hearing more from John tomorrow. But in the meantime, I suggest you watch a wonderful 15-minute overview of the SOAR cognitive architecture as part of a workshop that was run by the University of Vernon last year. So over to ACT-R. I only want to mention it because if SOAR is probably the best known cognitive architecture, ACT-R runs a close second, developed by John Anderson, also in CMU. It's different in that it really is trying to map onto the structure of and the physiology of the human brain. It's also a production system, and it's still being worked on. And it's another candidate for a unified theory of cognition. But again, really focusing here on correlates with brain activity. LIDA is another one. It's Stan Franklin's cognitive architecture. Here's a summary from our survey of them. I'm not going to walk you through this. This is the latest diagram showing the key aspect of LIDA. What I want to point out is over here on the right-hand side, global workspace. So global workspace is a theory of cognition which says there are many potential active agents or processes working, and one of them is selected, and it is in charge for a while, and then it's deselected and another one gets selected. But you'll see here again the same memories that we saw in SOAR: procedural memory, in this case that's skill memory, sensory motor memory, spatial memory, declarative memory, which is your semantic and episodic memory. And if you want to know more about it, Sean Kugle did a great job summarizing the LIDA cognitive architecture in another 15-minute overview. And I strongly encourage, if you're interested in that, watch that, it's terrific. Brain-based devices, I mentioned Jeff Kritschmar. So Jeff Kritschmar introduced a series of architectures called Darwin. And these are Jeff Kritschmar's approach to developmental neuromimetic. So neuromimetic simply means you're mimicking the neural structure of the brain. That's not the same thing as a connectionist approach. It's not a neural network like a deep network like ResNet or VGG or something like that. It really is looking at the different regions of the brain and how they feed off one another and how the interaction between them brings about intelligent behavior. So you get reentrant connectivity within these regions. And it's effectively all about creating adaptive behavior. And you learn these behaviors by interacting with the world. So there's a series of them. Darwin 8 can discriminate visual targets. It's got 28 neural areas, 54,000 neural units, and 1.7. Now, in the era of deep learning we're in, and foundation models with transformer architectures where we have billions of parameters, this doesn't seem very impressive, but that's to miss the point. This is not trying to do statistical learning the way we have with foundation transformer models. It's trying to create intelligent behavior by the interacting sub areas in your system. So do not be deceived by the fact that these numbers, while they were large when they were being developed, are small by modern standards. It's a different architecture. So 90,000 neural units in Darwin 10, It's a value-based system, and it's modeling the dopamine system in the brain. And here's a famous a test from psychology, the Morris water maze, where the rats learn how to navigate efficiently to a platform. This with just after 8 trials, it goes straight there. And so the idea here is to mimic that with Darwin. So we have a dry version of the water maze, and we have the mobile robot being the rat, and it learns. Basically, it's building its own model of a hippocampus and learning where things are by exploring the world. If you want to know more about that, Jeff did a great job as well with his 15-minute overview of his cognitive architecture. I can't talk about cognitive architectures without mentioning Clarion. So this is Ron Sun's famous cognitive architecture. There's a book to go with it too, which was published recently. It took a long time to get there, but Clarion's have been what goes back to the early 90s. What's really exceptional about Clarion is not that it's got 4 subsystems, but rather that each subsystem has got a connectionist or sub-symbolic level and an explicit symbolic layer. So Clarion is probably the best example we have today of a hybrid cognitive architecture where you have an exchange of information between the symbolic and the sub-symbolic in both directions. And that's the key thing about Clarion, that it takes that hybrid model very, very seriously and builds a strong bridge between the 2 forms of representation and processing. And again, we have a wonderful 15-minute video that Ron gave last year as part of the Transair workshop in Bremen. So Isaac is one of my favorite teaching architectures because it's got everything. So I want to talk about Isaac. Isaac is Kazuhiko Kawamura's cognitive architecture. Again, it's been developed over many years. Originally for, this is an old humanoid robot now, we can do better today. But nonetheless, the architecture is still valid and viable. It's hybrid. And it's based on these concurrent software agents, all of which are operating asynchronously. We've got a perception agent, we've got our action agents, and we've got this first order agent is important. So you get a very rapid response, a connection between your perceptions and your actions. So you can take urgent action if necessary. You've got memory. Memory is very important in cognitive architectures. So the short-term memory is your memory of what's happening in the world at the moment, encapsulated in an egosphere, so all the percepts that are happening around you. But your attention is very important. You can't pay attention to everything, so you pay attention to the things that are important. And then we again have here, you're beginning to get familiar with these terms, semantic, episodic, procedural memory. But now procedural memory is different to what we had in SOAR. This is memory about motor actions. So this is the motions that you can perform. So this is your skill memory. And then your declarative, semantic, episodic memory, things in the world. So your episodic memory here is your autobiographical memory of things that have happened to you as you've acted in the world, and all the links between them. And it's a multi-layered episodic memory. Working memory, as we saw with SOAR, is where the action happens, in the sense that this is where you achieve your goals and how you decide how you're going to achieve your goals. And so it's think of it as kind of a cache memory for, in this case, for your short-term memory. I'll show you how that works in just a moment. I'll first of all cover the other agents, the 4 other agents that we have in Isaac. A central executive agent, which is effectively driving the system. And then an internal rehearsal system, which is allowing you to determine what would be the outcome of an action if I carried it out. What's interesting about Isaac, and why I usually include it in when I'm teaching, is that it's got intention agents and affect agents. In other words, it's got emotions. So your emotions are the things that are helping you decide what actions to take, in the same way that the brain does through the amygdala. So the amygdala modulates the basal ganglia, which is selecting the actions you perform at any one moment. And then the agent is effectively determining what goals you're trying to achieve. So the way that it works is that your first order response agent is important because it will have an immediate reactive trigger if something urgent needs to be done, but it also takes responsibility for carrying out tasks. So it goes to your procedural memory, it says, do I know how to solve this? It puts that into working memory along with your current percepts, and if that skill can achieve the current goal, then it sends it over to your activation agents and they carry out your thing. So if you know how to do something, you recall it from memory and you enact it. So that's one way of doing things. But if you don't have a matching skill, then you have to do some problem solving. And so in that case, the central executive and the internal rehearsal system takes over. And so it gets some previous experience, loads that in together with the existing percepts, and then forms a strategy, puts that into the working memory, and then that gets sent to your activation agent, and you carry out your action, having internally rehearsed it to see, yes, I would get the action or the outcome I need. And again, Kazuhiko Kawamura does a much better job than I am here with his 15-minute overview of Isaac. Again, worth listening to. So lots of homework to do this evening as you're preparing for tomorrow. But they're excellent video overviews, and I strongly encourage you to have a look. Which leads me to the last of cognitive architecture, because it's the EASE fall school we're at. So I want to talk about CRAM. So CRAM stands for Cognitive Robot Abstract Machine. It's a hybrid cognitive architecture. You know what that means now, but it's got symbolic and sub-symbolic representations. Introduced by Michael Bates in 2010, but has been developed significantly since that over the past 12 years, including the EASE project. And it's specifically designed to address robot manipulation in everyday activities, the type of things that people would carry out in an apartment, in a kitchen. There's a couple of important design principles in CRAM I want you to be aware of if you're not already. And that is, the first one is that it focuses on implicit to explicit manipulation. That is to say, it would like to be able to interpret a request to do something without all that request having to tell you how to do it. So fetch the spoon and put it on the table, for example. So that's a vaguely stated high-level goal. And CRAM, as an architecture, then orchestrates all the things that are necessary in order to identify the low-level motions which get the spoon and put it on the table. So it effectively, think of it as a way of expanding these high-level, vaguely stated goals. And how does it do that? It does it using what's called in CRAM a generative model. Think of that as a tightly coupled symbolic and sub-symbolic knowledge system of the robot, of the tasks it can perform, of the objects in its environment, and the environment in which it's operating. And so remember I mentioned this earlier on, the idea that we have under-specified tasks. This is exactly what CRAM is targeting, pursuing goals, but being able to do it with under-specified tasks. So how does it do it? It focuses on this abstract specification of robot actions, like fetch the milk, fetch the spoon, pour it in the bowl. And in order to carry out that task, you need to find out how to do it. And we call that resolving all of the unresolved issues, and it's done at runtime. How is it done? It's done by using a knowledge base. Some of that knowledge is prior knowledge. Some of it is based on the current world state. And some of it is based on knowledge of the robot itself. So let me drill down that in just a little bit. So then once you do generate your what's called a generalized action plan, and it's the idea that you can state this vague term and then resolve that plan into the specifics in order to carry out the action. One of the nice things about that is that that plan can be reasoned about. So in other words, this opens up the possibility that your understanding of how to carry out a task can be improved. So not only can you execute a plan, but you can reason on your plan and you can effectively do self-programming and development. So that's a very important part of the CRAM cognitive architecture. So we map from our generalized action plan to our motion plan. And CRAM is the device, the machinery that orchestrates that mapping. It does it, as I'll show you in a moment, through a three-step process, which is referred to in CRAM as contextualization. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to identify the parameter values that you would use for your motions, which would successfully carry out the action which is suggested in the generalized action plan. And so that means we have terminology in CRAM different terminology, which means the same thing. We talk about an underdetermined action description. We saw that at the beginning, fetch the spoon, pour the milk, clean the table. And that's encapsulated then in a plan. And that's your generalized action plan. And you execute that. To execute it means that you have to resolve what's called an action designator. In this case, a high level one. And I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. So all of these things are effectively referring to the same idea, that I'm mapping from this general statement to this specific instantiation, which I can execute. So CRAM is, here's the architecture diagram. It's got 5 core elements. I'm going to walk you through them. There's the plan executive. I'm just going to call it it's a CRAM plan language executive. I'll call it the plan executive for short. And it is the thing that executes a plan written in a plan language, which is an extension of Lisp. And it represents everything in its world using first order logic. And those plans are also represented in this form, and they can be reasoned about. And you'll see that that becomes important when I talk about one of the elements of CRAM called cogito in just a moment. So these plans specify how the robot should respond to its current sensory events, its current belief states about the world. And importantly in robotics, if you're a roboticist, you know that your plans don't always work, and you have to be able to deal with that failure. And if you're not, if you can't do that, it won't be successful. And all of these can be reasoned about. So then, what does a plan comprise? It comprises a set of these abstract plan designators, and they require, so that's a placeholder. So things you need to know, and you need to find out, and you find them out using the generative model at runtime. And there are 4 classes of these. We can talk about a designator for actions, for objects, for locations in the world, and this is the important one, these elementary movements that you make. We call these motions, right? So the plan executive interprets this action plan, which is written in Lisp. Here's an example. So this is a high level one. So this is a fetch and place high level action plan. So it's a plan written in Lisp, which is going to carry out an action to fetch something, a spoon, and place it somewhere on the table. And the details of the language don't matter. Once you get used to programming that in Lisp, it becomes very, very intuitive. The key thing here, though, is that high-level designator gets translated into a series of low-level ones. And here I've shown you, we have to identify the object, the location, and another object where you're going to put the spoon, for example. So these are still designators, they're still placeholders, and you still have to fill in the values which make them meaningful for this task. And so how's that done? That's done by resolving them, and it resolves them using perception, using information or knowledge that's embedded in the plan executive, but in particular using a reasoning engine called NoRob. So NoRob is CRAM's knowledge representation and reasoning executive, and it's got many different parts. Let me walk you through them quickly. So think of NoRob as your generative model. It's the thing that's giving you the motion values that you need in order to carry out your action successfully. You could think of it as a joint distribution over motion parameters and associated effects. So NoRob knows if you do this, this is what's going to happen. Why is that important? It's important because you know what you want to happen. And so NoRob is the engine which is telling you how to achieve that outcome that you desire. So it forms this basis for mapping from your desired outcomes to the motion parameter values that you need. Some people might refer to this as an inverse model. Effectively, that's what it's doing. It's telling you how to achieve what you want. To do that, it's got an ontology with axiomatization. So this is its core of its knowledge base. It organizes its knowledge of the world, knowledge about everything, and the roles that all of these things play, and how you can use them. It's got a symbolic knowledge base, which is a way of abstracting symbolic knowledge about the world. The term I'm using here are nemes. What's a neme? A neme is a narrative-enabled episodic memory. This is one of the core pioneering developments in the CRAM cognitive architecture. Effectively, it extends the idea of episodic memory. Remember, episodic memory is your autobiographical memory of the world. but it includes a symbolic narrative. So if I give it to you like this, so I have everything that happens as I'm carrying out a task at a low level, sub-symbolic, sensory motor level, and then it also integrates a narrative annotation. This is what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And the two together are what form this concept of a name, which then gets subsumed into your symbolic knowledge base. So think of a name as experience, as you've carried out an action, and a narrative explaining what the purpose of that was. So this is very different. So a name in CRAM encapsulates both your procedural and your declarative knowledge, which makes it quite different from other cognitive architectures. So it allows you to answer questions. What were you doing when you did something? How did you do it? That's important because if you want to do it again, you can use your name in order to inform your future actions. But before you do, you'll carry it out in an internal world, sometimes called a digital twin world. And here you'll be able to carry out the plan before you execute it in the real world. So a very, very high quality VR engine with Unreal, the physics engine. So you simulate the outcome of your actions before you commit to doing it in the real world, effectively establishing the feasibility of the action. It also provides, and this is important, symbolic names for these properties so that you can find out things that you need to know. What does a spoon look like? What's its weight? How should I grasp it? So all of these things can then be used in your simulation. So your inner world knowledge base, your digital twin, serves both the roles of representing your belief state, my understanding of the world based on my perceptions and my knowledge of the world, and then a way of determining the outcome of your actions so that you can decide which is the right action to take to achieve the goal of your task. So these two types of knowledge in here, your current beliefs and your projected internal simulation of future states. So it's the state of the world as it is and the world as it might be if I was to carry out that object. Because of that, you can also use it as a learning mechanism. So you can use this inner world as a way of training your system, learning how, well, if I did this and if I did that. So you can dream about the world in a sense and determine other ways of doing things through this. There's a virtual knowledge base of data structures. This is a very cool way of allowing your sub-symbolic information to be presented to the world as symbolic. So that's just the mechanism which allows that to be done. And that's important because it means that NoRob presents itself as a logic-based system to the outside world, but it's inside, it's sub-symbolic. So that's what it's doing here. It presents itself as a symbolic knowledge base to the world, though internally it's got many, many different symbolic and sub-symbolic representations. And so it could be treated as a symbolic object-oriented query system. And that turns out to be kind of useful because it can be used by your plan executive or other systems through the open ease interface. So other people can query NoRob and find out how they should do things. Other robots in other labs around the world. So that gives you rise to this query and response behavior of CRAM as it's carrying out its generalized action plans. It's also useful for your metacognition, which is querying the knowledge base if it wants to transform its plans and perform what's called metacognition is thinking about thinking. Can I improve the way I'm thinking? We have an action executive called Giscard. It's the thing that carries out the action. And of course, we've got RoboSherlock, which is the perception executive, which determines the state of the world through your sensor systems. And then Cognito is the aspect of CRAM, which is trying to do plan generalization and plan specialization. So there's a lot in it. All right, let me finish off by walking you through to try and ground this a generalized action plan. Remember, I'm trying to map from my generalized action plan to my specific motion plan via this three-step contextualization. So I have a generalized action plan for fetching, for placing, pouring, cutting. And what do I do then as I populate that with the things I want to fetch and place? Then what do? I need to contextualize. My three-step contextualization, first of all, instantiates these things, the objects that I want, and then it creates these designators, which are placeholders. And then it extends that by mapping it to your low-level motion plan. Said, okay, I'm going to map my high-level plan to a low-level motion plan, and I now need to know the following. I need to know what object, where it is, what pose, which arm I'm going to use, how should I grasp it, how should I lift it, all the things you need to carry out the low-level motion plan. And what does it do then? It then queries NOROB and it says, okay, please give me these values. NOROB does its magic, uses its generative model, all the things with its digital twin inner world, produces the best candidate motion parameter values based on its reasoning, based on its prospection, based on its operation of its inner world digital twin, and then sends these motion specifications, these parameter values back to the plan executive, which then populates the motion plan and sends it off to Gitzcard, and Gitzcard says, thank you very much, and then carries that out adaptively. So it's not, the Gitzcard Action Executive is also very adaptive in the way that it can carry out that plan. Okay, so we're there. If you want to learn more, I have a website, and if you go to my teaching page, I have a course for which I generated for the IEEE on cognitive robotics. And what I've just been rehearsing here has been lectures 1 to 6 of module 7. So you've just gotten my really quick fire hose version of 6 lectures, which I would normally give in this. So all of the details of what I talked about are there if you want them. I've used up my 45 minutes, pretty much exactly. So I'll stop and say thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. And I encourage you again, the videos from the Transair workshop are amazing. They're a fantastic resource, and it's wonderful to have that collection. And of course, I've only mentioned some of them. We've got Alessandra Sciuti, she's going to be speaking, I think it's tomorrow as well. So she has her video, and many others. So have a look at those videos. It's a fantastic way of getting up to speed really quickly in this domain. I'm done. Thank you.
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, great. So we're already okay. So thank you. If you have any questions to David, please come to this microphone, because this time we can't throw around our microphone. So yeah.
So hi, and thank you very much for this nice talk. I have a question regarding the taxonomy about cognitive architectures. So you said you have the cognitivistic architectures, emergent architectures, and hybrid architectures. Sure. And for me, it's sometimes hard to really classify the different cognitive architectures into this schema. So and in the review you mentioned from Kotzeruba and Tsotsos, sometimes cognitive architectures are classified, for example, the SOA cognitive architecture is classified to be hybrid, but I've also read surveys where this architecture is classified to be cognitivistic because of the symbolic representation in the working memory. And the same, for example, for the ICAP architecture. I think here it is hybrid, and in one of your books you mentioned it to be emergent because of the developmental aspects. Yeah. And the question is, do you think there are clear borders between those architectures, or is it kind of soft?
Well, every taxonomy draws a borderline, right? So you make a distinction. You make a distinction based on criteria. And I've always drawn this distinction between emergent, cognitivist, and hybrid. And so it came as a great relief to me. When I read John Tsotsos's paper, that they had adopted the same course, let's call it top-level division between the two. And you're absolutely right that in one of my books, I do classify SOAR as cognitivist, because it originally was. It was purely based, my understanding of it, reading all of the early papers, it was purely knowledge-based, and it was all symbolic processing. It's not anymore. It now does have sub-symbolic, but I want to impress on you that hybrid with a little h. Hybrid is anything which exhibits sub-symbolic and symbolic processing in one architecture. And that's effectively it. Now, John Tsotsos then, of course, distinguishes between different types, which I haven't done in the past. So he talks about the fully integrated type, and then symbolic sub-processing. Symbolic processing is symbolic processing is symbolic processing. So that's very clear. And these were prevalent at the outset, and they're not prevalent anymore. It's mostly the hybrid approaches. And then there's the emergent. So to answer your question, is this a taxonomy which can fit everything? I've yet to come across a cognitive architecture which cannot be mapped onto this in some sense. If you look at the criteria they use for that classification. If you have a cognitive architecture that can't be mapped, I'd be interested in knowing about it. The ICOB, for example, was sub-symbolic, so as well, it had some sub-symbolic, but it was, and to be fair, the ICOB cognitive architecture as an architecture was never fully realized. There's now the ICOB software framework, which is a slightly different thing. That's a collection of software utilities which you can use in order to create cognitive behaviors. But as a unified cognitive architecture, it's not quite there, which is why there's an ICOG project ongoing at the moment to take it to the next step. Have I answered your question? I'm not sure I have.
Okay, thank you very much. The categories you were talking about were the ones in the slide before, right? You had the list of different categories, how to classify. So if it's emergent or cognitivistic.
Yeah, that's what I'm showing. Can you see my screen still?
Yeah, this is the, yeah.
Yeah. So this is just with the SOAR one here. So, and you're right, but ask John. John will tell you. I mean, it is currently, as I see. Well, this was the classification by Tsatsas and Katsaruba. I'm pretty sure John will agree with that, but I don't know. I haven't asked him, and I can't remember from his video from last year. But I didn't mention Paul Verschuur's. I mean, there's another one I was going to add. I was going to inflict yet another cognitive architecture on this morning, but I thought, no, you've had enough. So I was about to talk about Paul Verschuur's one, which is really worth a look at. It's an emergent one which does neuronal modeling, and it, by the way, has been used with the ICUP cognitive robot as well. So the ICUP humanoid robot has been used as a platform for exercising DAC-H3. So there's yeah, but I don't know. I think this is a pretty complete taxonomy. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Hi, David.
Hey.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm probably as tired as you are after that.
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to thank you for this nice explanation of how the CRAM architecture works, because I did not manage to pull that off. And with your knowledge, you can just really put it into the bigger picture and the right picture.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, I owe it all to Michael, right? So Michael and I had many long conversations when I was working in Bremen last year, and I thought I understood CRAM before I came to Bremen, and then I discovered I didn't. And I basically it's just encapsulating that framework that Michael patiently, very patiently explained to me over a full year. So I can't really take any credit for that. So, but thank you anyway.
And I'm very sorry that the architecture will change over the next couple of years, and you need to learn it all again. But this may just happen.
Have you just given me a heart attack? Are you serious, Rid? Is it going to change?
Yeah, at least this metacognition and long-term memory stuff, I want to do something with that, but I'll keep you informed.
Okay. All right. Okay. I have a few ideas of my own about how it can be extended. So let's talk.
Yeah, you have. Cool. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
By the way, while I'm waiting for Jorn to go back, can I just comment about that last thing there? You'll have seen, right? If I can just go to the next slide. Cognitive architecture projects never end. I mean, some do, because people but the good ones carry on forever. It's an enormous undertaking, and so I'm actually very happy to hear that it's going to evolve. So that's great, and evolution is a good thing. So I look forward to the next chapter.
Okay, thank you. So I look around here, but no further questions, right? Okay, so thank you for giving this nice talk. and a nice overview over all the architectures. And yeah,
On time,
I think-
amazing.
So we can have now a little break. After the break, we can start our little lab tour, and I'm happy to welcome you. I think in 50 minutes or something, then we can start with our lab tour. So thank you.
All the best. Have a great school.